The galactic beacon pulsed with an urgency that hadn't been seen in centuries. The Empire's flagship, Dominion's Hand, floated lifeless in the depths of the Zainara Nebula, a black spot of silence in a galaxy where its name had commanded fear and awe. The mighty dreadnought, centerpiece of the Emperor's fleet, had faltered at the worst possible moment. It was stranded deep in contested territory, surrounded by the ruins of lesser ships it had obliterated, and the threat of retaliation loomed like a coiled serpent in the dark. The Imperial Admiralty had sent out a universal distress signal, encoded with a level of desperation uncharacteristic of the Empire. Assistance from its elite forces was slow, tangled in bureaucratic snares and distant conflicts. The urgency of the situation demanded a rapid response. And to the Empire's horror, the only reply came not from a military powerhouse or an engineering think tank, but from the SS Spacer's Rest, a ramshackle freighter registered to an obscure Earth-based repair guild. On board, the mechanic grinned at the encrypted distress message projected in midair before him. He was a man of wiry build, perpetually oil-streaked, with a scrappy demeanor that suggested he preferred duct tape over diplomacy. His name was Mackenzie Mac Holt. His reputation? Infamous among the guild for taking jobs nobody wanted and solving problems in ways that left supervisors muttering about regulations. Max sipped his coffee, black sludge brewed from beans questionably labeled as Earth Heritage, as the ship's AI, an outdated model affectionately named Bits, voiced its skepticism. Do I need to remind you, Mac, that we're a two-person operation and not remotely qualified for this level of catastrophe? Bit's synthetic voice held a tone of exasperated incredulity. Correction, Mac said, sliding on his goggles with a practiced air. We're a one-person, one-machine operation, and qualifications are overrated. You're going to die, Bits replied flatly. Probably, Mac said, his grin widening. But do you know what else is likely? One hell of a paycheck if I pull this off. The ship shuddered as it jumped into hyperspace. Mac leaned back in his seat, hands behind his head, as he watched the swirling colors of the void streak by. Somewhere out there, an Imperial Colossus waited for a hero. Instead, it was getting Mac and his trusty wrench. When the SS Spacer's Rest dropped out of hyperspace near the Dominion's Hand, the sight was both breathtaking and bleak. The dreadnought was a masterpiece of engineering, 5 kilometers long, bristling with weaponry, its sleek black hull a testament to the Empire's might. But now, it was eerily still. Fires burned in isolated sections, its engines flickered weakly, and debris floated in a widening halo around it. This, Bits said, scanning the wreckage, is worse than expected. Max squinted at the ship. Looks like someone yanked out its guts and forgot to sew it up. Perfect. Perfect? Bits echoed. You're insane. Mac piloted the freighter closer, navigating through the debris field with precision born from years of patching up dying ships in the harshest conditions. He activated the comms. This is Mac Holt, Guild-registered repair technician. Heard you've got a problem, and lucky for you, I've got solutions. There was a pause before the comm crackled with a terse, clipped voice. This is Commander Rylos of the Dominion's Hand. What reinforcements did you bring? Reinforcements? Mac laughed. I brought me a half-broken AI and a toolbox. What else do you need? Another pause. This is a classy emergency, Rylos growled. We requested elite engineers, not whatever this is. Well, you got me, Max said cheerfully. Now are you going to open your docking bay, or am I knocking? Moments later, the freighter docked in the belly of the massive dreadnought. The interior was a stark contrast to the sleek exterior. Hallways were dimly lit, conduits hung loose from walls, and the air was thick with the acrid scent of burnt circuitry. Max stepped off his ship, toolbox in hand, as a group of armored Imperial soldiers approached. Their polished uniforms were marred with soot, and their faces were a mixture of disbelief and disdain. You're joking, one muttered. Mac ignored the mutters and grinned at the commander, a severe-looking man with a scar running across his jaw. Nice to meet you, Commander. Where's the patient? Rylos scowled. The ship's core systems are failing. Power's intermittent. Weapons are offline. Navigation is dead. And we're being hunted. Mac raised an eyebrow. Sounds like a busy day. Show me the core. As the soldiers led him deeper into the ship, the scale of the damage became evident. Entire sections were sealed off, emergency lighting flickered erratically, and engineers worked frantically to patch critical systems. The dreadnought wasn't just broken, it was dying. When they reached the core, Mac whistled low. The massive reactor was a tangled mess of shattered components, leaking energy in volatile bursts. Nearby engineers scrambled to contain the damage, their tools woefully inadequate for the task. This, Mac said, setting down his toolbox, is going to be fun. Fun? Rylos barked. This ship is the pride of the Empire. If you fail, we'll be torn apart by the enemy. Relax, Mac said, pulling out his wrench. I've fixed worse. Probably. Ignoring the glares of the crew, Mac got to work. He moved with a confidence that bordered on reckless, dismantling damaged components with lightning speed and improvising repairs with materials scavenged from the wreckage. When a critical coolant pipe burst, threatening to overheat the reactor, Max sealed it with a combination of adhesive foam and duct tape. That's not regulation, an engineer protested. Neither is exploding, Mac shot back. Hours passed as Mac wrestled with the failing reactor, his unorthodox methods drawing a mix of awe and exasperation from the crew. Despite the chaos, he seemed to thrive, his mind racing ahead of the problems, his hands a blur of motion. Finally, as the reactor hummed back to life, Rylos approached, his expression grudgingly impressed. You stabilized it, he admitted. But this ship still isn't battle-ready. Not yet, Max said, grinning as he wiped his hands on his coveralls. But I'm just getting started. Unknown to them, a shadowy fleet lurked in the nebula, closing in on the crippled dreadnought. The true test was yet to come. The ship's corridors hummed faintly, the reactor stabilization barely holding. Mac's makeshift repairs had bought time, but the Dominion's hand was still a long way from being operational. He stood in the engineering bay, surveying the damage reports streaming across multiple holoscreens. The magnitude of the problem was daunting, but Mac's grin never wavered. All right, he said, cracking his knuckles. Let's patch this bird up before someone decides to blow it out of the sky. Bits chimed in through his comms, the AI's voice as sardonic as ever. You've stabilized the reactor, but life support is failing in 3 sectors, the targeting arrays are fried, and the hull integrity is down to 60%. Did I mention the incoming hostile fleet? Sounds like a challenge, Mac replied. And you know how much I love those. Commander Rylos appeared on the main screen, his scowl deepening as he regarded Mac. Your quick fixes won't hold under fire, mechanic. We need full systems restored immediately. Full systems? Mac raised an eyebrow. You do realize I'm not a magician, right? No, Rylos said coldly. You're the only person insane enough to volunteer for this. Which means you'd better deliver. Mac chuckled, grabbing his trusty wrench. Don't worry, Commander. I'll have this tin can singing in no time. The communication cut out, and Mac got to work. The engineering bay was a chaotic maze of damaged consoles and sparking conduits, but Mac navigated it like a seasoned explorer. He prioritized the essentials: life support, navigation, and shields. The targeting arrays could wait. No point firing weapons if the ship couldn't stay alive long enough to aim them. As he worked, a low vibration rippled through the ship, followed by a distant explosion. Bits? Mac called out, his hands deep in a malfunctioning conduit. Hostiles have engaged, Bits replied. Enemy fighters are strafing the dreadnought. Shields are offline, and evasive maneuvers are limited. Limited how? Mac asked. As in non-existent, Bits said dryly. The navigation thrusters are barely functional, thanks to the last decade of neglect. Mac groaned. Great. I'll add it to the list. He sprinted toward the navigation hub, dodging falling debris and the occasional panicked crew member. When he arrived, the situation was worse than he'd anticipated. The thruster's control systems were completely unresponsive, and several consoles had been reduced to smoking heaps of slag. A junior engineer looked up at him, wide-eyed. "We're doomed." "Not yet, kid," Max said, dropping his toolbox. "But you might want to brace yourself. Things are about to get messy." He tore into the thruster systems with a ferocity that left the junior engineer speechless. Where others saw chaos, Max saw opportunity. He rerouted power from non-essential systems, cannibalized parts from auxiliary consoles, and used every trick in his book to coax the thrusters back to life. "Bits," he said through gritted teeth. "What's our status?" "Fighters are targeting critical sections," the AI replied. "Hull breaches are imminent. Also, I may have underestimated their numbers." "Fantastic," Mac muttered. He slammed a final panel into place, and the thrusters roared to life. "Tell Rylos he's got his evasive maneuvers back. But if he wants them to last, he'd better keep the ship out of trouble for at least an hour." "Unlikely," Bits said. As Mac moved to his next task, the ship shuddered violently. Overhead, a bulkhead buckled, sending a cascade of sparks raining down. Mac shielded his face, cursing under his breath. "Rylos better give me a bonus for this," he muttered. Moments later, his calm crackled with the commander's voice. "Mechanic, we've detected a boarding party breaching the starboard airlock. If they reach the core, this ship is finished." Mac froze. "You're telling me there are enemy soldiers on this ship?" "Yes," Rylos replied. "And they're armed to the teeth. What's your point?" "My point," Mac said, grabbing his wrench, "is that I'm not a soldier." "Then improvise," Rylos said coldly, before cutting the comm. Max sighed, hefting his wrench as he made his way toward the starboard airlock. The sound of gunfire grew louder with each step, and his heart pounded in his chest. When he arrived, the scene was pure chaos. Imperial soldiers were pinned down behind hastily erected barricades, exchanging fire with a squad of heavily armored invaders. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the walls, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. Mac crouched behind a console, surveying the battlefield. His eyes landed on a set of exposed pipes running along the ceiling, their labels indicating a high-pressure coolant system. "Bits," he whispered. "Can you redirect coolant flow to those pipes?" "Yes," Bits replied cautiously. "Why?" "Just do it," Mac said, pulling a multi-tool from his belt. As the invaders advanced, Mac worked quickly, cutting into the pipes and rerouting the coolant flow. When the pressure gauge spiked, he grabbed a nearby wrench and slammed it into the makeshift valve. The result was immediate. A jet of freezing coolant erupted from the pipes, engulfing the invaders in a cloud of frost. Their armor froze solid, their movements slowing as the extreme cold took its toll. The Imperial soldiers seized the opportunity, launching a counterattack that drove the remaining invaders back. Mac leaned against the console, breathing heavily. "That," he said, "was not in the job description." "Mechanic," Rylo's voice crackled over the comm. "The boarding party has been neutralized." "Good work." Yeah, Mac said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Now, can I get back to saving your ship?" "By all means," Rylos replied. "But hurry. The enemy fleet is preparing for a second assault." Mac groaned, grabbing his toolbox. The Dominion's hand wasn't just a ship, it was a battlefield. And the battle was far from over. Mac barely had time to catch his breath before the ship shuddered again, the tremor more violent than any before. Lights flickered, and alarms blared through the corridors. Bit's voice echoed in his calm. "Enemy fleet has regrouped. They've brought heavier artillery this time. Shields are holding, but only barely." "How barely?" Mac asked, sprinting down a corridor toward the weapons bay. 5% integrity," Bits replied. "Ah," Mac said, gritting his teeth. "So, not holding at all." He skidded into the weapons bay, where a cluster of engineers frantically worked on the targeting arrays. Sparks flew, and the room was filled with the acrid smell of scorched wiring. Mac assessed the situation in a glance. The main control console was shattered, its surface blackened from an earlier explosion. Auxiliary power was barely trickling into the targeting systems, and the weapon cores were offline. "All right, people," Mac barked, stepping forward. "Clear out. Let the professional handle this." The engineers hesitated, exchanging skeptical glances. One, a middle-aged woman with a grease-streaked face, folded her arms. "And who the hell are you?" "The guy who's going to keep this ship from being a flaming pile of scrap," Mac said, dropping his toolbox onto the console. "Now move." Reluctantly, they backed away, giving him room. Mac didn't waste a second. He dove into the mess of circuitry and wiring, bypassing fried relays and rerouting power directly to the weapon cores. The targeting system was ancient by his standards, a relic of a bygone era of imperial engineering, but he understood its principles. "Bits," he called out, sweat dripping from his brow. "What's the status of the enemy fleet?" "Closing fast," Bits replied. 3 battleships and 24 smaller crafts. They've deployed long-range cannons. First volley incoming in 60 seconds. Mac's heart pounded. "Tell Rylos to brace for impact. I need another 3 minutes to get these arrays online." "You have 60 seconds, Bits said flatly. Mac worked faster, his hands a blur as he spliced wires and reassembled shattered components. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. When the first volley hit, the ship bucked violently, throwing him against the console. "Shields are down," Bits reported. "Hull breaches in multiple sectors." "Noted!" Mac shouted, picking himself up and diving back into his work. Finally, the targeting arrays flickered to life, their status lights glowing weakly. Mac slammed the console, forcing it to reroute power from non-essential systems. "There!" he yelled. "Weapons are back online." Rylo's voice crackled through the calm. "We're targeting the lead battleship. Can the arrays hold?" Mac grinned, grabbing his wrench. "They'll hold. Just don't miss." The Dominion's hand roared to life, its weapons firing in coordinated volleys. Beams of energy lanced through the darkness, striking the enemy fleet with devastating precision. The lead battleship shuddered under the assault, its shields collapsing in a spectacular burst of light. "Direct hit," Bits said. "The battleship is disabled." "Good," Mac said, wiping sweat from his face. "Now let's—" He was cut off by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the entire ship. "What was that?" he asked. "Enemy reinforcements," Bits replied grimly. "A Dreadnought-class ship just entered the field." Mac's stomach sank as the massive silhouette of the enemy dreadnought emerged from the shadows. It dwarfed the Dominion's hand, its sleek, predatory design a stark contrast to the Imperial vessel's battered state. "Well, that's just cheating," Mac muttered. The enemy dreadnought wasted no time, unleashing a barrage of plasma bolts that tore through the Dominion's hand. Explosions rippled through the ship, and the lights flickered ominously. "Shields are gone," Bits reported. "Hull integrity is critical." Mac clenched his fists. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and running out of time. But he wasn't ready to give up. "Bits," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "How much power do we have left in the reactor?" "Barely enough to keep life support online," Bits replied. "Why?" "Because I'm about to do something incredibly stupid," Mac said. He sprinted toward the engineering bay, dodging falling debris and panicked crew members. When he arrived, the reactor was a chaotic mess of hissing pipes and sparking conduits. Mac ignored the chaos and began rerouting power from every non-critical system. "What are you doing?" Bits demanded. "Overcharging the reactor," Mac said, his hands moving with purpose. "If I can channel enough energy into the main weapon, we might have a shot at taking out that dreadnought. Or you'll blow us all to pieces," Bits said. "Details," Mac muttered. He worked frantically, his mind racing ahead of his hands. The reactor groaned under the strain, its core glowing dangerously bright. Alarms blared, and warning messages filled the screens around him. "Rylos," Mac called through the calm. "I need the crew to clear out of the forward sections. Things are about to get explosive." "What are you planning, mechanic?" Rylos asked. "Something stupid," Mac replied. "Trust me." The reactor reached critical levels, its energy output surging beyond safe limits. Mac activated the targeting arrays, locking onto the enemy dreadnought. "Here goes nothing," he said, slamming the activation switch. The Dominion's hand fired a single, massive beam of energy, its intensity rivaling the sun. The beam struck the enemy dreadnought, slicing through its hull with devastating precision. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the enemy's ship erupted in a blinding explosion. The shockwave rippled through space, buffeting the Dominion's hand. Mac was thrown off his feet, landing hard against the bulkhead. The lights flickered, and the reactor groaned before stabilizing. "Bits," he croaked. "Status? The enemy dreadnought is destroyed," Bits said, disbelief evident even in its synthetic voice. Mac laughed weakly, pulling himself to his feet. "Told you it would work." "You're insane," Bits said. "Yeah," Mac said, grinning despite the pain. "But you can't argue with results." The battle was far from over, but for the first time, the crew of the Dominion's hand had hope. And that was enough to keep fighting. The aftermath of the dreadnought's destruction left the battlefield in stunned silence. Wreckage drifted through the void, glowing embers of what had been the mightiest ship in the enemy fleet. Inside the Dominion's hand, the damage was severe but survivable. Mac leaned against the reactor console, his body screaming in protest from the abuse it had taken. Around him, the engineering bay was a war zone of overturned equipment, fried circuits, and coolant pooling on the floor. He took a long, shaky breath before Bit's voice cut through his brief moment of calm. "Enemy forces are regrouping. Remaining ships are advancing in formation." Mac groaned. "Can't they take a hint? We just vaporized their biggest gun." "Apparently, they're slow learners," Bits quipped. "Also, there's one more problem." "Of course there is. The reactor's core is destabilized," Bits continued. "That overcharge maneuver has left it on the verge of meltdown." Mac ran a hand down his face. "Naturally. All right, what's the damage?" "Critical systems are barely functional. Hull integrity is at 30%. And if the core isn't stabilized in the next 5 minutes, we'll cease to exist in a very dramatic fashion." "Good to know," Mac said, grabbing his wrench and a patch kit. "Let's save this rust bucket one more time." He moved to the reactor, his every step deliberate. This wasn't the chaotic rush of earlier, this was precision work, and Mac knew there was no margin for error. Sparks danced in the air as he patched leaks and rerouted power to cooling systems. While he worked, the comm crackled with Rylo's voice. "Mechanic, we're taking heavy fire. The remaining fleet is targeting our weakest points. What's your status?" "Busy," Mac said tersely. "Well, be busy faster," Rylos snapped. "If they breach the hull, your efforts won't matter." Mac ignored him, focusing on a ruptured coolant pipe that was spewing superheated vapor. He tightened a valve, redirecting the flow to the secondary system. "Bits, give me good news," he said. "The good news is you've slowed the reactor's meltdown. The bad news is it's still happening," Bits replied. "Also, I detect boarding pods heading for the rear sections." "Of course there are boarding pods," Mac muttered. "Because this day wasn't exciting enough." The lights flickered, and the ship groaned ominously. A new tremor rippled through the engineering bay, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal tearing. "Bits? Rear bulkhead compromised," Bits reported. "Boarding party has breached Sector 7. Mac's grip on his wrench tightened. He wasn't a soldier, but the rear sections contained vital systems. If the invaders reached them, the ship was finished. "Fine," he said, standing and grabbing a plasma cutter. "Let's deal with this the old-fashioned way." Mac made his way to the rear sections, where chaos reigned. The boarding party had advanced quickly, their sleek, armored figures cutting through the unprepared defense teams. Mac took cover behind a damaged console, assessing the situation. He spotted a stack of fuel canisters near the invaders' position. A grin spread across his face. Bits, can you overload the auxiliary power grid in this section? Are you asking me to turn this area into a fireball? Bits asked. Exactly, Mac said. Consider it done. As Bits began rerouting power, Mac activated the plasma cutter, slicing through the supports holding the canisters in place. They toppled, rolling toward the invaders. Now! Mac shouted. The auxiliary grid overloaded with a deafening crack, and a surge of energy ignited the canisters. The explosion rocked the section, sending the invaders flying. Mac didn't wait for the dust to settle. He charged forward, using his wrench to knock out the dazed enemies. The few who remained standing were quickly overwhelmed by the reinvigorated defense team. With the boarding party neutralized, Mac turned back to the reactor. The ship was on its last legs, but Mac wasn't about to let it die. He worked tirelessly, patching the final leaks and stabilizing the reactor's core. The room was stifling, the air thick with heat and fumes, but Mac didn't falter. Bits, he said, his voice hoarse. Status? The reactor is stabilizing, Bits replied. Hull breaches are sealed. The remaining enemy fleet is retreating. Mac slumped against the console, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. We did it, he said, a weary smile on his face. No, Bits said. *U* did it. Mac laughed weakly. Don't get sentimental on me, Bits. The calm crackled again, and Rilo's voice came through. Mechanic, the enemy fleet is in full retreat. The ship is holding. Against all odds, you've saved us. You're welcome, Mac said, closing his eyes. Now, if you don't mind, I'm taking a nap. Wake me up when someone else breaks something. Rilos chuckled. Well earned, Mechanic. Well earned. As Mac drifted off, the Dominion's hand limped away from the battlefield, battered but victorious. In the days to come, stories would spread about the mechanic who saved the ship with nothing but a wrench and an unshakable resolve. But for Mac, it was just another job well done.